by Arielle, and the title of her capstone is Hot, Cool, Yours, Russia's Cultural Diplomacy in the Sochi Olympics.
So what comes to mind when we imagine Russia? For some, this might be bears and snow and onion domes. It might be communism, the Cold War, or Vladimir Putin doing one of his PR stunts. Or, for some, it might be ballet and classical music and the great Russian writers. We all form images of other cultures and countries, and these images are what help us determine the way we treat them in everyday life, in the media, and in foreign policy decisions. My capstone is about the ways Russia uses cultural diplomacy to improve its image in the world and promote its nation brand. So I started with the questions of how cultural diplomacy is used, what are its goals and objectives, and how successful is it at is Russia at achieving these goals. To focus my research, I decided to look at the Sochi Olympics of 2014. I chose it because this is by far Russia's biggest project. It's one that was 7 years in the making, and it literally put Russia on center stage of the international arena. Also, you only have to look back to the 1980 Olympics and the Miracle on Ice game or the boycott of Moscow Olympics to see the importance that the Olympic movement and sports in general can have for the politics and on the politics in the minds of a nation. So ultimately, I'm addressing the question of how and to what effect Russia used the Sochi Olympics as an opportunity for building its global image and promoting its nation brand. So for Russia's current goals and strategies regarding cultural diplomacy, I turn to the concept documents on Russia's foreign policy, which has 3 goals that are related to the topic. First, there's the defense and support of the rights and interests of Russian citizens and nationals living abroad. Second is the promotion of an objective perception of the world of Russia as a democratic state with a socially oriented market economy and independent foreign policy. And third is the support and popularization of the Russian language and culture in foreign countries, emphasizing its importance in global culture in the contemporary world. So more specifics on these goals are laid out in a document called Main Directions of Policy of the Russian Federation in the Sphere of International Cultural Humanitarian Cooperation, which was published by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 2010. So here, cultural diplomacy is defined as ties in the sphere of culture, art, science, education, mass media, youth exchanges, sport and tourism, and others. So the goals that are set out are forming and strengthening relations of trust and mutual understanding with foreign countries, and building up the country's participation in the system of intercultural cooperation and the integration of Russia into the global cultural sphere. It's also important to know that the cultural diplomacy serves domestic goals as well, such as the economic development and modernization, unity and cohesion across the country's regions, strengthening of the spirituality of Russian society, and preserving cultural and moral values of the nation. So in my research, I found that there are 3 target audiences that are supposed to receive these cultural diplomacy messages. First, and what they call their number 1 priority, is Russians living abroad. I'm not focusing on this audience in my research because I find it's less about image building and more about supporting compatriots and preserving existing ties. Second audience is the international community as a whole, and this originally was going to be my primary area of focus for my study, but my research has led me to the conclusion that the 3rd target audience, which is the domestic Russian audience, is also very important, maybe more important than the international community, so I have to discuss that as well. So Russia uses a lot of strategies to achieve these goals, but my focus is on the technique of nation branding through the Sochi Olympics. Nation branding is a strategy that many countries have started to use over the last couple decades, where your country's image is treated like a product or a good that is marketed abroad to make the country more likable and more well-known on the world stage. So this concept was developed by Simon Anholt, and his nation brand hexagon has 6 components. So it measures perceptions of a country's exports, investment, immigration, people, how hospitable they are, governance, so how fairly and how competently a country is governed, and a country's cultural heritage. Russia typically ranks relatively low in the index, but its strongest area is culture. So cultural diplomacy allows Russia to play to its strengths, and part of the reason I chose the Sochi to explore this was that Anhalt's advice for Russia to improve its brand was to reshape its cultural image in the world by managing big and amazing projects and events that tackle structural modernization of the country and establish Russia as a global competitor. And the Sochi Olympics was just that. So it showcased the world, Russia's people, culture, governance, and it was designed to bring in tourism, visitors, and investment, and sell Russia to the world, which is everything that a good nation brand needs. So now I'll tell you a little about my case study of the Sochi 2014. My analysis of the Russian media coverage and speeches about Sochi has resulted in like 3 dominating narratives when it comes to Russia's goals with Sochi and nation branding. First is a strong power narrative, where Russia wanted to show itself capable of organizing and hosting the Winter Olympics. And there's a strong focus on modernity, economically, showing that they're economically strong, worthy of an investment, and able to ensure hospitality, security, and top-notch infrastructure. And then the second narrative is changing of stereotypes. So everyone was mentioning they wanted to show the world a new Russia, alter stereotypes and prejudices against the country, and create a more positive image in the world. And then the third narrative is a comeback narrative, or a rebirth of the country on the global stage after troubles that the country faced politically, economically, and athletically in the 1990s. So in terms of, I'm going to sum up where I'm going with this overall in the general summary. So in the years leading up to Sochi, much of the focus was on finances and infrastructure and just construction, and this took away from attention that could be given to nation branding opportunity. However, the games themselves were conducted extremely well and held great potential for realizing cultural diplomacy goals. Unfortunately, the events in Crimea and Ukraine that immediately followed the Olympics really overshadowed Sochi in the international eye and canceled out any positive effects that would have resulted. However, Sochi did have a lasting positive effects on domestic audiences in terms of how they viewed their own country, and it contributed to a surge in national pride and patriotism. So here I'm going to give you a snapshot of what I've been working with so far. I'm trying to organize it by time period and by goals and what people thought of it. So the idea to have Sochi host the Winter Olympics was first thought of in the 1980s and then again in the 1990s, but Russia just wasn't able to fund or carry out any project that big. It wasn't until Putin's leadership that the dream of Sochi became a reality. So in 2007, Russia's official bid was presented to the International Olympic Committee in Guatemala by a lot of famous athletes and top politicians. So Putin's speech, he pledged to make Sochi Olympics a safe, enjoyable, and memorable time. And he drew on Sochi's ties to ancient Greece, emphasizing Russia's connections with democracy and European culture. And he promised good governance, emphasizing security, infrastructure, and up-to-date mass communications. And he also made a reference to the comeback narrative by bringing up how Russia's sport was so devastated after the fall of the Soviet Union, and that this was Russia's chance to rebuild and come back. So for the next 7 years, Russia had the daunting task not only of building an Olympic capital from the ground up, but also promoting Sochi as a part of its nation building campaign to reverse negative Russian stereotypes. So I have a quote from leader of the Sochi Organizing Committee, Dmitry Chernyshenko. He said, "We must show that Russia is not vodka, balalaika, nesting dolls, not even ballet with the cosmos. The Olympics is a window we are opening to the world. What we show, the world will see." However, there's a lot of criticism as to what extent this campaign was successful leading up to Sochi. For example, it was argued that too much attention was focused on just being able to build and finance everything and just get the infrastructure in place and get it done, and this detracted from the nation branding opportunity. And besides that, Russia also invested a lot in its own domestic sports programs and athletes, because Russia had a very humiliating performance in Vancouver 2010 Winter Olympics, so it was viewed as vitally important to perform well on their home soil to win the Olympics, which they did. So when interesting thing I just stumbled upon in my search in terms of criticism for Sochi's marketing was an art exhibit in Perm by Vasily Slanov called Welcome Sochi 2014. You see some examples here on the screen of some of his work, but all of it was posters that used traditional Russian symbols or traditional Olympic symbols in a pretty gruesome and ironic way. This exhibit was shut down by the authorities for illegal use of Sochi symbols and for also being Russophobic and defamatory towards Sochi. However, Slanov saw his work not as anti-Russian, but as a critique of the government's poor approach to branding Sochi and as an opportunity lost to change Russian stereotypes. So he was showing in these posters Russia through Western eyes. So it's really a critique of stereotypes of Russia. I also looked at the Sochi emblem, poster, and slogan, which is on the next slide. So the emblem is quite simple. It's the first time that there's been, which that's in the upper corner there, there's been no image or drawn component. It's just the graphic there. And the intent here is to showcase Russia's modernity. Chernyshenko said, "To prove our commitment to innovation, the Sochi 2014 emblem is clearly digital. Today, we welcome tomorrow. Our emblem challenges people to look beyond what they expect from our country." So here we're emphasizing modernity and trying to change stereotypes. I've also looked at the months leading up to Sochi and the kind of press Russia was getting in the international media. It was bad press, as I'm sure you recall. So the world was concerned with security problems, lack of infrastructure, unfinished construction, and massive corruption, which, as far as I can tell, happens before most Olympic Games. And there's also a huge uproar about human rights in Russia, especially, and proposed boycotts regarding the treatment of LGBT community in Russia. And also stray dogs were being euthanized. And so this led to a Sochi shaming campaign in social media called Sochi Problems, which I've included some images there. So during the actual Olympics, I've done a close analysis of both the opening and the closing ceremonies, because this is essentially 6 hours of programming where Russia had the opportunity to show the world exactly how it wanted to be seen and perceived. So the opening ceremony was a journey across Russian history, and the closing ceremony was a journey through Russian culture. And the important themes that I gathered from what they put on is establishing Russia's cultural uniqueness and its contributions to global culture, the arts and sciences, and modernity and innovation, common themes. The history segment started with the Enlightenment, went through Tsarist times, and it continued through the Soviet period, which was shown as one of industrialization and innovation, but then it stopped. And the cultural segment focused on Russian fine arts, ballet, composers, writers, and the circus. What interests me, however, is what was not covered in these programmings. So if one goal of Sochi was to show the world a new Russia, I thought that though the ceremonies didn't necessarily show what happened in New Russia, so it stayed with, the ceremonies highlight Russia's strengths and greatness in the cultural spheres, but it stays within things that Russia's already known for. So I wouldn't say it exactly altered views of Russia. And finally, what I come to is the legacy of Sochi. So I'm hoping to be able to gauge to what extent the Olympics were successful in achieving cultural diplomacy goals, which were to depict Russia as strong and capable global power, to reverse negative stereotypes, and to make a comeback for Russia from its time of troubles. So this is obviously fairly subjective and difficult to measure, but I'm looking at the saturation of Sochi's message, who was watching, how much, and the reactions in the media and public opinion, as well as from individuals who were actually there on the ground in Sochi, the athletes, volunteers, and visitors. In terms of viewership, in terms of viewership, the IOC's marketing report reveals that Sochi was the most watched Winter Olympics in the history of the worldwide, and it set records in hours of TV coverage and in viewership, both TV and online. So in that sense, it was a success. And from testimonials by athletes, the Olympic athletes and visitors to Sochi, most of them are very impressed with what they experienced there. They are pleased with the facilities and amazed by the warmth and hospitality of the Russian people and the Russian culture. So in that sense, it was also a success. And a friend of mine was a volunteer in Sochi, and she had very positive things to say about security at the games. And she said that the Olympic villages, so the facilities where the athletes and coaches were staying, were really great. And so those two were probably two of the most important things, and they were well done. So she said that while media and volunteer accommodations were maybe not up to par, this was the first time an Olympic host had ever tried to provide both meals and accommodation for free for all of the Olympic volunteers, of which there were 29,000. So given that, they probably did a pretty good job. So overall, she says Russia put on a very successful Olympics. And what I'm still grappling with is public opinion and the media. I'm still sorting through reactions. But what I'm seeing is it's hard to overcome all the bad press that Sochi problems and everything the Olympics had before, and also the events that happened immediately after. So, because everything got clouded by other events. So the Crimean crisis began almost immediately after Sochi Olympics ended, which makes it even more difficult to assess any changes in Russia's image abroad that Sochi would have brought. So this all overshadowed Sochi's legacy in foreigners' eyes. But what I've seen is the domestic impact of Sochi, it went a long way. So Russians were very proud of what they did in Sochi, and they're very much more confident in their own views of themselves and their people, culture, their role in the world, their governance. So the Sochi Olympics do a good job in promoting the domestic goals of cultural diplomacy, such as economic development, modernization, unity, cohesion across the country's regions, and those things. And they definitely felt like this was a show of Russia's rebirth as a global power. However, in terms of the international image and nation brand of Russia, ultimately I think it comes down to actions speaking more than words. So Sochi, no matter how great a show Sochi was, the actions in the international arena can overshadow any image building or nation branding campaign.
Okay, thank you. Let me just pursue that a little bit. So you're focusing obviously on the domestic impact of cultural diplomacy, although obviously when we think about diplomacy, we normally think that applies to other countries. And what you're saying is that it was quite successful domestically. I mean, Russians were in general proud of this, but obviously it was not successful internationally, particularly because it was then immediately followed by what happened in Crimea. So from the point of view of the people who are conducting this, the Kremlin, the people around the Kremlin, who devised this cultural diplomacy strategy, what do you think matters most to them?
I think given what happened after Sochi Olympics, what matters most was the domestic effects. So this was something that Russia could be proud of, and no one could say that Sochi was poorly done, and everyone who was there on the ground was impressed. So the athletes, the visitors, the volunteers, the IOC was also very impressed. But the media didn't catch that, and I don't think Russia tried really hard to make that happen. But I think what was most important was just the pride at being able to do it.
Yeah, and I think probably also helped fuel all of this popularity that we see with Putin. Yes?
I have a question that has to do with both security issues and the interethnic angle, because after all, Sochi itself is on the territory of people who considered themselves to be Circassians and who had wanted either parallel games or a little bit more recognition during the games. So my question is how you perceive why they didn't let more of the Circassian cultural presence in. A completely secure multi-ethnic Russia might have been able to do that. What was going on there with the politics of the Circassian games and why they were denied, or why their presence even in the first opening was seemingly downplayed to the extreme?
Yeah, so obviously a part of it was just a huge political issue, but then another element I think would be, well, if they showcase one of Russia's nation's that might create like discontent among others, because Russia has many different peoples that were also not showcased, although they also were not hosting the games on their homeland. Part of it, I think, was Russia trying to portray like a cohesive unity. They were trying to emphasize the cohesion and unity, and also they showcased what Russia is already most known for. And if the international audience maybe doesn't know about the Circassian culture, then Russia was clearly trying to focus on the Russian greats that everybody already knows.
So I remember the Sochi Problems campaign, as I think many people do, and I'm wondering whether that was the campaign that was mostly on Western social media and whether there was a Russian equivalent, because I think that in looking at the problems, part of it goes to people's expectations. So in a way, you saw these pictures and suddenly your expectations of what was going to happen at the Olympics were like really low, in which case you could be very pleased when, for the most part, everything went well. But I'm wondering if for the domestic audience, their worries about how the Olympics would go and their concerns about what the negatives might be were different from the Western ones.
Yeah, so I actually read a really interesting article where they did, some scholars, I forget the authors, but they did a really in-depth like linguistic political analysis of like what was going on in the Russian media for the whole 7-year process. And there were lots of articles that were also like, voicing skepticism on Sochi, especially with corruption and all the money that was going into it and the security issues. Those were the big worries coming in over the years. What else was I going to say?
So was there any kind of social media campaign in Russia right at the lead up?
So I've gone through like one of the hashtag, like tagged Sochi problem stuff, and some of it is Russian, but I think what happened was when it like blew up in the Western media, most of Russians got very defensive of it, and they saw it as a Schadenfreude thing. So it was, they weren't so much making fun of this. They did, however, in the closing ceremonies, Russia showed their sense of humor by making fun of a glitch that had happened in the first ceremony. So they showed they're not above making fun of these sorts of things and admitting that they do happen.
You talked about how in the West, anyway, the events of Crimea sort of overshadowed whatever effects this could have, positive effects this would have for the Russian image. And I was just wondering whether in places that are kind of less tuned into what was going on in Crimea, places like China or South Asia or Africa or Latin America, whether there maybe the effect was more long-lasting of Sochi. Did you run across any sort of speculation about what the reception was like in those areas?
That is definitely something I need to look into more. You know, viewership-wise, I think it was a little less viewed in those areas than in the West. But I haven't come across that reception yet, but I should.
Yeah.
Actually, a related question to that. I know there were big hopes that Sochi would be a hub for tourism. I know that's not your main topic, but have you come across stories about whether foreign visitors, for instance, are coming to Sochi?
Since then, I haven't come across anything like that. That would be something I'd be interested in seeing. I know they've used Sochi for hosting other events besides the Olympics, so they are using it as a hub for like conferences and other sporting events. So even if tourists aren't coming just individually, it's still a thing for organized things.
I was there in October. It was pretty deserted, but I think they were waiting for the ski season to begin. But I think the answer to that is that I don't think there's that much foreign tourism. I mean, I follow this a little bit, although I mean, obviously Russians are going in and they have nice facilities there. You know, it's so far I think hasn't become the tourist attraction that they wanted it to be.
It's still hard to get a visa.
It is still hard to get a visa.
Okay, thank you very much.